Imagine two old neighbors, the USA and Mexico, living side by side for years. They've had their ups and downs, but lately, there's a new problem causing major headaches for both: powerful drug cartels. These are organizations like Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation Cartel. For years, they have ravaged Mexico, and death tolls are only on the rise. Now, they've become global threats too. From being called terrorist organizations to being blamed for the fentanyl epidemic, big Mexican cartels are now public enemy number one in the States.
The most powerful is the Sinaloa cartel. Almost the 70% of the world is infected by this cartel.
The CJNG is one of the most powerful and dangerous criminal organizations in Mexico, characterized by a business model of extreme violence and trafficking in the most deadly of substances.
Now, here's where things get interesting. The US government, feeling frustrated and maybe a bit desperate, is starting to talk about sending in the troops. Yep, you heard that right. Actual military intervention to take on these cartels. It's a big deal, and it's got people on both sides of the border talking.
Drug cartels in Mexico have been terrorizing Americans for decades. We're going to unleash the fury and might of the United States against these cartels.
So, buckle up, because we're about to take a wild ride through the history of these cartels. We'll look into why the US thinks bringing out the big guns literally might be necessary, and what could go wrong if they do. But here's the million-dollar question: is the US's new tough guy approach actually safe? Could it end up creating even bigger problems than the ones it's trying to solve? And what about Mexico? How do they feel about their powerful neighbor potentially sending troops onto their turf? Let's find out. To understand the current situation, we must first look at how Mexican drug cartels emerged and evolved into the powerful organizations they are today. The early origins of these groups can be traced back to the 1960s and 70s, when Mexican drug trafficking organizations initially focused on marijuana and opium production, working as suppliers for Colombian cartels. This period laid the groundwork for what would become a much larger and more complex criminal enterprise. The 1980s and 1990s saw a significant shift in the drug trade landscape. As U.S. efforts disrupted Caribbean trafficking routes, Mexican cartels seized the opportunity to become the primary transporters of Colombian cocaine into the United States. This strategic move dramatically increased their profits and power, setting the stage for their rapid expansion and growing influence. The turn of the millennium brought new challenges and changes to the cartel landscape. Government crackdowns led to the fragmentation of larger cartels into smaller, more violent factions competing for territory and smuggling routes. This period was marked by escalating violence and a shift in the power dynamics among various criminal groups. Sadly, over and over again, every big move against cartels generates a bigger, more destructive reaction. It's almost like those on the right side of the law can't win. In recent years, from the 2010s to the present, cartels have demonstrated remarkable adaptability and ambition. They've expanded their operations beyond drug trafficking, diversifying into other criminal activities like human trafficking, extortion, and fuel theft. They've also adopted more advanced weaponry and tactics, often rivaling or surpassing the capabilities of local law enforcement and military units.
The Jalisco New Generation Cartel took the fight to the next level, shooting down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade.
What we've seen in the last 20 years is some of the cartels have become much more powerful, so that it becomes the cartels actually bullying and controlling elements of the security forces.
This evolution has made them even more formidable and difficult to combat using traditional law enforcement methods. The authorities in Mexico and the US are constantly thinking of new ways to curb cartels' growth. Today, Mexican cartels are more powerful than ever. And there's a long list of reasons for this. Widespread corruption within Mexican law enforcement and government institutions has allowed cartels to operate with relative impunity, often co-opting officials at various levels of government. This corruption is fueled by the enormous profits from drug trafficking, estimated at $13 to $50 billion annually, which provide cartels with vast resources to bribe officials, recruit members, and acquire sophisticated weapons and technology.
Otra vez quieren mujeres.
So the police come here and you bribe them with women?
Es lo que piden y es lo que le damos. Si ellos vienen en buen plan, pues nosotros en buen plan, nosotros cooperamos con ellos. Y si ellos vienen en modo agresivo contra nosotros, pues nosotros nomás repelemos la agresión.
The weakness of certain key institutions in Mexico has also played a role in the cartel's rise to power. The criminal justice system, in particular, struggles with low conviction rates and prison security issues, failing to effectively deter cartel activity. This institutional weakness creates an environment where criminal organizations can thrive with limited fear of consequences. Technologically, cartels have kept pace with or even surpassed law enforcement capabilities. They've acquired military-grade weapons, including assault rifles, grenade launchers, and even armored vehicles.
They have a very intelligent strategy, which is basically branding themselves and looking like paramilitary power. They do have their full letters, right? The C, J, and G on their vests. They dressed as properly military. They also have these high caliber guns. They have what they call those monstruos, which are really basically what man-made tanks, you know?
Many cartels have also recruited former military and police personnel, allowing them to adopt sophisticated combat tactics and organizational structures that mirror those of professional armed forces. The use of cutting-edge technology extends beyond weaponry. Cartels utilize advanced communication systems, drones for surveillance and smuggling, and have even been known to use custom-built submarines for drug transport.
¿Un dron o qué?
Ese mero.
¿Dónde está el dron?
Está volando derecho arriba.
Hay un dron.
This technological edge allows them to stay one step ahead of law enforcement efforts and expand their operations with increasing efficiency.
Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, is the single criminal organization most responsible for these deaths on both sides of the border.
Perhaps most alarmingly, in some regions of Mexico, cartels have effectively replaced government authority, providing basic services and security to local populations. This level of territorial control not only strengthens their operational base, but also wins them a degree of local support, or at least acquiescence, making it even more challenging for authorities to combat their influence. Historically, U.S. involvement in combating Mexican cartels has been limited to advisory and support roles. The Merida Initiative, launched in 2008, established a partnership between the U.S. and Mexico to provide training, equipment, and intelligence support to Mexican law enforcement and military. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, aka the DEA, has worked closely with Mexican authorities on investigations and arrests of cartel leaders. Additionally, there has been increased funding and personnel for U.S. Customs and Border Protection to interdict drug shipments and prevent cartel violence from spilling over the border. However, the persistent threat posed by cartels and several high-profile incidents have led to calls for more direct U.S. military action. Despite years of effort, cartel-related violence in Mexico remains high, with over 30,000 homicides annually in recent years. The fentanyl crisis has added urgency to the situation, as Mexican cartels have become the primary source of this deadly opioid entering the U.S., contributing to a devastating epidemic.
These cartels are responsible for virtually all of the fentanyl, and they currently dominate the worldwide fentanyl distribution and supply chain.
Fentanyl is a silent killer, deadlier than any street drug we've seen before, and it's tearing through American communities like wildfire. In 2021 alone, this synthetic opioid had a hand in over 71,000 overdose deaths. That's more than 2/3 of all drug fatalities. And who's behind this tsunami of tragedy? Largely, it's the Mexican cartels, pumping this stuff across the border by the tons every day. They've hit the jackpot with fentanyl. It's crazy potent. 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine, and dirt cheap to make. The result? American streets are flooded with a drug so dangerous, it's like playing Russian roulette every time someone uses. We're not just talking about lost lives here, though that's devastating enough. Families are being torn apart, hospitals are overwhelmed, and the economic hit is a staggering $700 billion each year. That's 3.5% of the country's entire GDP. Tragically, fentanyl's showing up everywhere now, laced into other drugs and fake pills. It means folks who think they're just having a casual night out could end up in the ER, or worse. This isn't just a drug problem anymore. It's a national tragedy unfolding before our eyes.
People are being exposed to fentanyl without knowing it, and because it's so highly potent, people are dying at unprecedented rates.
Attacks on U.S. citizens in Mexico have also heightened concerns about cartel violence and its potential to directly impact American lives. There have been several incidents of Americans killed or kidnapped in Mexico, often in cases of mistaken identity or being caught in the crossfire of cartel conflicts.
They tried to make us have sex with each other, but
told them we was brothers and sisters.
Brother and sister, and that she was pregnant. He was hit 2 times and big chunks of meat was gone out of him.
I remember I was bleeding, like blood from this hole was like pouring like that, and I smelled like piss, like poop, like throw up, like bleach, like blood.
These people went through hell. Of course, it's not just Americans who go through this at the hands of monster sicarios. It's countless Mexicans too, and visitors from other countries. But when U.S. citizens report crimes like these, the American government seems to care a little more. Adding to these concerns are reports of cartels targeting U.S. law enforcement and even military personnel operating near the border, further blurring the line between criminal activity and national security threats. So, in 2023, a decision was made. In March 2023, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham announced plans to introduce legislation that would designate certain Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs.
Drug cartels in Mexico have been terrorizing Americans for decades. We're going to unleash the fury and might of the United States against these cartels.
This move would potentially authorize the use of U.S. military force against these groups. The proposed actions could include using armed drones to target cartel leadership and infrastructure, conducting covert special forces raids to capture or eliminate high-value cartel targets, enhancing intelligence gathering by deploying more surveillance assets to monitor cartel activities, and increasing U.S. troop deployments along the border to support interdiction efforts.
We're going to destroy their business model and their lifestyle because our national security and the security of the United States as a whole depends on us taking decisive action. I have a two-step approach to this.
Supporters of this approach argue that these measures would give the U.S. government more powerful tools to disrupt cartel operations and protect American lives. They contend that the cartel's paramilitary capabilities and transnational reach justify treating them as a military threat rather than solely a law enforcement issue. Proponents often point to successful military operations against terrorist organizations as a model for how similar tactics could be employed against drug cartels. While the idea of direct military action against cartels may seem appealing to some, it carries significant risks and potential negative consequences that must be carefully considered. Unilateral U.S. military operations in Mexico would likely damage the crucial bilateral relationship between the two countries, potentially undermining cooperation in other areas such as trade and immigration. The Mexican government and public would likely view U.S. military action as a violation of their national sovereignty, stirring up historical tensions and resentment. There's also a serious risk that direct U.S. intervention could lead to an escalation of violence as cartels retaliate or adapt their tactics to counter military pressure. Military strikes in populated areas risk harming innocent civilians, which could damage public support for anti-cartel efforts and potentially drive more people into the arms of criminal organizations that often position themselves as protectors of local communities. The use of military force against non-state actors in a foreign country raises complex legal and ethical questions that could have far-reaching implications for international law and U.S. foreign policy. there are concerns that such action could set a precedent for other nations to justify military interventions under the guise of combating criminal organizations. Economically, increased instability resulting from military action could harm cross-border trade and investment, affecting both the U.S. and Mexican economies at a time when economic cooperation between the two nations is more important than ever. Finally, history shows that cartels are highly adaptable. Military pressure alone may simply cause them to shift operations or splinter into new groups, potentially creating an even more complex and diffuse threat. It's crucial to understand that the Mexican government has consistently opposed the idea of U.S. military intervention on its soil. From Mexico's perspective, there is a strong sense of nationalism and historical wariness of U.S. intervention in Mexican affairs. The memory of past conflicts and territorial losses to the United States still influences Mexican public opinion and policy decisions. While combating cartels is undoubtedly important to Mexican authorities, the government may have other pressing economic and social concerns that it prioritizes. There are legitimate fears that U.S. military action could lead to a broader conflict or civil unrest, potentially destabilizing the country and causing more harm than good. On top of that, big Mexican cartels like the Sinaloa and CJNG are also deeply intertwined with criminal organizations in other countries like China. Hence, more potential unrest.
What would it mean? It means that all the precursors coming for China, Chinese chemical companies and Chinese enterprises, would be subject to being prosecuted under U.S. law for providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations, something you can't do today.
The current Mexican administration, led by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has emphasized social programs and economic development as alternatives to a militarized approach to fighting cartels. This hugs not bullets strategy reflects a belief that addressing root causes of cartel recruitment, such as poverty and lack of opportunities, is more effective in the long term than direct confrontation. Of course, Senator Lindsey Graham disagrees.
I'm a firm believer that the prosecution model as it exists today is not working. So what are we going to do? We're going to up the ante. We're going to designate these groups and others, if appropriate, foreign terrorist organizations under U.S. law, changing the game for those who provide assistance to them.
Instead of direct military intervention, experts suggest several alternative strategies for addressing the cartel threat. Continued support for reform and capacity building within Mexico's law enforcement and judicial systems could help strengthen these crucial institutions and reduce the impunity that cartels often enjoy. Enhancing efforts to disrupt cartel money laundering and seize illicit assets could strike at the financial heart of these organizations, potentially crippling their operations more effectively than military action. Addressing the demand side of the equation is equally important. Investing in addiction treatment and prevention programs in the U.S. could decrease the market for cartel products, undermining their primary source of income. Supporting economic development programs that provide alternative livelihoods in cartel-affected regions of Mexico could reduce the pool of potential recruits for criminal organizations. Improving intelligence sharing between U.S. and Mexican authorities could enhance the effectiveness of law enforcement efforts without the risks associated with military intervention. This could involve prioritizing actions against the most violent cartels or those trafficking the deadliest drugs like fentanyl, focusing resources where they can have the greatest impact.
More people died in the United States from fentanyl poisoning than car wrecks and gun violence combined. Fentanyl is becoming the leading cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 45. 200 Americans die every day due to fentanyl overdoses.
Efforts to stop the flow of weapons from the U.S. into Mexico, which arms many cartels, could also play a crucial role in reducing cartel capabilities. Stricter gun control measures and enhanced border inspections for southbound traffic could help stem this flow of arms. The January 2023 arrest of Ovidio Guzman, son of notorious Sinaloa cartel leader El Chapo Guzman, illustrates both the capabilities and limitations of current anti-cartel efforts. Mexican security forces conducted a complex raid to capture Guzman in Culiacan, Sinaloa, demonstrating improved operational capabilities. However, the arrest triggered widespread violence, with cartel members setting up roadblocks and engaging in gun battles with authorities, highlighting the ongoing strength and influence of these organizations.
Violence paralyzed the streets of a Mexican city yesterday as security forces traded gunfire with heavily armed members of a drug cartel. The son of the notorious drug kingpin El Chapo was taken into custody, then let go.
The Mexican military played a crucial role in the operation, showcasing their growing anti-cartel capabilities. While not directly involved in the raid, U.S. intelligence likely contributed to locating Guzman, exemplifying the potential benefits of bilateral cooperation. However, despite this high-profile success, the operation and its aftermath highlighted the persistent strength and influence of cartels in their strongholds, showing the complexity of the challenge faced by both Mexican and U.S. authorities. While discussions of military action and law enforcement dominate headlines, it's crucial to remember the role of education and prevention in combating the influence of cartels. Implementing comprehensive awareness programs to educate young people about the dangers of drug use and the negative impacts of cartel activity on communities can help reduce demand and undermine cartel influence. Providing alternative career paths and educational opportunities is essential to prevent recruitment into cartels, especially in economically depressed regions where criminal organizations often prey on vulnerable youth. Supporting programs that strengthen social bonds and empower communities to resist cartel influence can build resilience against criminal infiltration. Media literacy education is increasingly important in an age where cartels use social media and popular culture to glamorize their lifestyle. Teaching critical thinking skills can help young people recognize and resist cartel propaganda and narco-culture glorification. Fostering cultural exchanges and partnerships between U.S. and Mexican youth can build cross-border understanding and solidarity in the face of shared challenges posed by transnational criminal organizations. The threat posed by Mexican drug cartels to both Mexico and the United States is undeniably serious. These organizations have evolved into giants that challenge the authority of governments and wreak havoc on communities on both sides of the border. Lindsey Graham put it another way.
Fentanyl overdoses cause the equivalent of a new September 11th every 2 weeks. I think John and I believe that if there were an ISIS or Al-Qaeda cell in Mexico that lobbed a rocket into Texas, we'd wipe them off the planet. They're doing that times thousands, and our response is inadequate. 106,000 people last year died of drug overdoses, 70,000 related to fentanyl, with no end in sight.
The death toll at the hands of Mexican cartels is impossible to even grasp. Many deaths go unreported, and countless others simply disappear, and their bodies are never found. Then, there's overdose deaths and victims of cartel wars, and even collateral damage from the ongoing turf wars in Mexico. So yeah, something must be done if we are to stop these growing monsters with ever more high-tech weaponry. However, the proposal to employ direct U.S. military action against cartels raises complex ethical, legal, and strategic questions that demand careful consideration. While the frustration with persistent cartel violence is understandable, it's essential to consider the potential long-term consequences of military intervention. The history of U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts suggests that military solutions alone are often insufficient to address deeply rooted social and economic issues. The risk of escalating violence, damaging crucial bilateral relations, and potentially worsening the situation for civilians in affected areas cannot be ignored. The allure of quick fixes through military action is tempting, but the reality is that dismantling the power of cartels will require sustained effort, international cooperation, and a willingness to address uncomfortable truths about drug policy and socioeconomic inequality on both sides of the border. By approaching this challenge with nuance, compassion, and a commitment to human rights, we can work towards a future where communities in both Mexico and the United States are free from the destructive influence of criminal organizations. The path forward requires not just governmental action, but also societal change. By fostering a culture that rejects the glorification of cartel lifestyles, supports those struggling with addiction, and provides meaningful opportunities for youth, we can undermine the very foundations upon which these criminal empires are built. This holistic approach while perhaps less dramatic than military raids, holds the promise of creating lasting change and breaking the cycle of violence and criminality that has plagued the US-Mexico border region for far too long. For now, we can only hope that the US will be tactful enough not to start a war with Mexico. Hey, thanks a bunch for tuning in. What do you think about Senator Lindsey Graham's decision? Do you think it could get out of hand? Leave a thoughtful comment down below. And before you leave, make sure you like, subscribe, and click that bell. See you soon. Stay safe.